This week's parasha, Shemini, contains two main sections. The first is the opening ceremony for the Mishkan, and the second is the dietary laws. Let's explore the first. The opening ceremony for the Mishkan. It was to be a moment of connection between the people and God. It was Aaron the Kohen at the height of his powers, demonstrating that he was able to bring the fire of God down on the altar and connect the divine with the mundane. But disaster strikes. Nadav and Avihu, his two elder sons, they appear as if out of nowhere and they perform an unauthorized incense ritual, and they die very suddenly in what is clearly an act of God. But what do they do wrong? Rabbinic interpretations abound. One says they were drunk, and that's learnt from a juxtaposition of a prohibition to drink wine, which follows immediately after this section. Another view is that they had the temerity to teach halacha, Jewish law, in the presence of Moshe, the lawgiver himself. And a third view suggests that it was a premature and distasteful leadership bid. This midrash has them saying, when will these old guys, that's Moshe and Aaron, die off so that we can take over? But actually, a simple reading of the verse produces none of those. Here's the section itself. It's at the beginning of chapter 10 of Vayikra. Vayichu v'nei Aaron Nadav v'Avihu ish machtosai. And the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan. Vayitnu v'ohen eish, and they placed glowing coals upon it. Vayasimu alem ketoris, and put incense on the glowing coals. That's how it was done. Vayakrivu lifnei Hashem eish zorah, and they brought near before God an alien fire, asher loyd sivo osom, that he had not commanded them, he being God. He had not commanded them. There's an emphasis in the verse on the word loy, that it was not commanded. The word loy contains a very rare note when it's read in the shul, called a mercha kafula, which draws attention to this as the central part of the verse. What they did was something that was not commanded. In essence, they seem to have made a decision to do their own thing, to invent their own ritual. We don't really know why, but we can speculate. And then Netziv, writing at the end of the 19th century, and Volozhin, compares this act with the act of the 250 men who come forward with fire pans to join Korach's rebellion much later in the story. Each, Nadav and Avihu and the 250 firepan men, perceive an opening for momentary, ecstatic experience, whatever the consequences, an instant of sublime connection, something which will make them feel wonderful, even if death follows. And of course we see that for the 250 men, and indeed Nadav and Avihu, that is exactly what follows. Rav Hirsch, writing a little earlier than the Netziv, focuses also on the phrase asher lo tzivah isom, that God had not commanded Nadav and Avihu to perform this ritual. He points out that incense was never brought as a private offering. It was always of the community. There's no such thing as private incense. And incense is supposed to represent the most sublime moment of divine service, complete absorption in the rituals of God on behalf of the community, finding favour before its God. The fact they brought a private offering in this context is inherently forbidden, because here, and Rav Hirsch points out, really in the entire system of divine worship, there is no place for arbitrariness, personal caprice, innovation. One must conform to the divine plan. This is very easy to understand, but as I'm saying it, I feel uncomfortable. It's very hard to do, and I'm worried, and I suspect many are worried, that this approach risks producing an arid, rigid religion which is completely devoid of spirit or individual expression. So to try to unpick that, we turn to Rav Soloveitchik. He elaborates, and in essence he agrees with Rav Hirsch, but he goes further. He calls the way of Nadav and Avihu paganism, the antithesis of the Torah approach, which, as he says, the paganism begins with excitement and culminates in sin and disillusionment. It very much parallels, this is still the quote, the approach of the modern world where one uses drugs or alcohol in order to create an artificial feeling of euphoria. For Rav Soloveitchik, paganism means putting oneself, one's own agenda, at the centre of religious life rather than God's agenda. These are harsh words, but he goes on, and this is the bit that I'd really like to share. Again, a quote. A mitzvah is not only a perfunctory action or divine performance, it must also translate into experiential terms. The Torah demands that we experience joy and satisfaction when we perform a mitzvah. A Jew fasts on Yom Kippur because God commanded it. However, the result of such obedience to God must be an ecstatic, illuminating experience that transforms one's personality. And he explains that this extraordinary outcome from following a very rigid set of rules to the letter is to be achieved first through surrender to the divine will, which starts as a prescribed set of obligations, and within that one will find personal creativity, longing expression of one's will to connect with the divine. And the two examples he gives, really we've touched on already and are relevant to this time of the year. One is eating matzah at the Seder. Why do we do it? Because we were commanded. Yet, during the Seder, it becomes an act of love for God. Why do we fast on Yom Kippur? Because God says so. The Torah says, Tanu es nafshosechem, fast on Yom Kippur. But we all know that as the day progresses, we move towards what Rav Soloveitchik calls a joyful catharsis, something we can all feel and know well when the day goes well. For me, it's a little bit like a violinist. The first violinist in a famous orchestra must play the notes exactly. You can't deviate from the score. You can't play a different tempo from the rest of the orchestra, and you must follow the directions of the conductor exactly. But there are mediocre violinists and there are virtuoso violinists, and they're playing the same notes. They just know how to invest it with some personal passion and a sense of creativity, and we all know the difference between one and the other, and we are required in our religious life to follow the rules exactly, but not as an attempt to crush our spirit, but to free it. Rav Soloveitchik also points out a custom which many are familiar with, which is that at the end of Pesach, once the day has ended and one makes Havdalah, many people, particularly the Vilna Gaon and those who follow him, had the custom to make Havdalah on beer, which is proper chometz. Why would you do this? You've either got to wait for it to be purchased back from the non-Jew or rush out and buy some. It's good to see that off-licenses are still on the list of essential services, even during the lockdown. Why did he do this? The purpose was to demonstrate that the reason he did not eat chometz during Pesach was not because he didn't like it, not because he preferred chometz foods to non-chometz foods, or vice versa, whichever way around it might be, but because he was doing it because God said so. And once Pesach's ended, I'll demonstrate I'm very happy drinking chometz, drinking beer. It's part of the same way of thinking, and Rav Soloveitchik is the spiritual inheritor of this Vilna Gaon way of thinking about the world. And I think it's an enlightening moment to know that we can find creativity within the system. And I wonder whether that's the reason why this section in the Torah that we've been studying is followed directly by the kashrus laws. In many ways, they define lives for those who follow them strictly. They invade every trip, every meal, every place we go, many social interactions. And they're very rigid, and sometimes they feel frustrating and limiting. But once again, it's part of a system within which one is supposed to find creativity, innovation, even within the legal system, which appears to be quite dry and unyielding. So I think the message of Parsha Shemini is the transition to a more mature recognition that creativity, spirituality, and the ability to reach God is not necessarily, and sometimes not at all, contingent on one's own innovation, but it can be found within conformity to the divine will. Have a wonderful Shabbos.